Good day and welcome to another episode of the Fighting Men of Rhodesia YouTube series. It's my pleasure today to be able to interview Chris Cox, a soldier, an author, a publisher and a podcaster, and a man known to many in the Rhodesian community. But at the end of this podcast, we'll be introducing the books that he's written, which I think might be of interest to our foreign viewers and for those of you that haven't read them. I loved his Facebook. I think it was called Fire Force, Chris. And Chris, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Yeah. No, I loved your book. I think I'm correct in saying Fire Force was your first one. We'll talk about it more in depth at the end of the chat. But it was a really interesting story. The way you wrote it, the style was very pleasurable and easy to read, and it engendered in me the thought of apocalypse now. I don't know why. Maybe because it was written as a narrative rather than in the third person. Just a very interesting story. So, Chris, give us a bit of a background of where you were born and raised and how you ended up in the RLI.
Well, fairly simple story. I was born in Salisbury, now in 1957. My parents were immigrants. My father was from England and my mother was a South African. They moved up to Rhodesia in 1955. So I was then sent to a little private school in Harare, a little school called St. John's, which is now a massive kind of massive school, private school in Harare with the high school and everything like that. So I went there in my primary school years. The first year in standard 1, I think we had standards then, was 1965, and I clearly remember hanging out by the staff room where they had the only wireless radio in the school, in the staff room, and it was on the 11th of November at 1 o'clock Rhodesian time, which was 11 a.m. UK time, which was the 11th of the 11th. And Ian Smith was declaring UDI. And I didn't fully understand. I mean, I was only, 8 at the time. I didn't fully understand the ramifications of it, but I knew it was a big thing. And I knew that there was going to be trouble. So I did my primary school years there at St. John's, and then my parents decided they'd like to keep me in the private school system, so I was then sent in 1971 to Peterhouse in Marandellas, where I did my high school years. That ended abruptly when I was pretty well expelled in my fifth form year, lower 6, and ended up in Commercial Careers College in Salisbury, where they didn't care whether you grew your hair long. There's no uniform. They didn't care if you smoked. We played pinball every other second. We were down the road from the pinball arcade. And there was absolutely no pressure on academically. It was up to you. If you wanted to work, you worked. And I kind of thrived in that environment and did okay, passed my A levels. And then it was in 1975. At around about the time we'd finished writing our A levels, we knew that the little brown envelope would be arriving in the post.
So efficient, as I've mentioned in other chats with other guys.
Yeah.
The Ministry of Manpower was darn efficient. I'll tell you what, they never lost anyone.
Yeah, pretty well the day I turned 18, which was 13th of November, boom, that little brown envelope with on government service was there. And in it, it instructed me to report to Cranbourne Barracks on 8th of January at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the morning. A lot of my mates got little brown envelopes telling them to report to Llewellyn. That was it. I had no intention of if I could have got out of national service, I would have. But because my parents were wanting to send me to an overseas university, I was told that I couldn't get any kind of exemption. I'd have to do my, at the time, 1-year national service, and then I could go to university. So that was it. National service, which then sort of morphed into 18 months. In, I think it was early 77, they increased national service. And then I don't know whether it was foolish or not, but I decided to sign on regular for a 3-year contract in the RLI. Yeah.
Is that because you started to enjoy the army, or just did you think, oh, what the hell am I going to do now?
Well, when it was increased, national service was increased to 18 months. They said, well, I could still do my 18 months. And because overseas university started in September, I could still do my 18 months and then go to university. If I'd gone to a South African university, for example, I could have possibly got the exemption to go after 1 year. Yeah, I think it was, Tony. I think by that stage, I'm sort of seriously enjoying the kind of camaraderie. Yeah, I was really starting to enjoy it. I think there was also a bit of a rebellious streak in me that I think, well, my parents would have been mortified. Well, they were mortified that I signed on regular. So there was that aspect. And yeah, it was a kind of a little bit of an impetuous thing as well. There was also the financial incentive that once you signed on as a regular, you would be back paid for whatever service you'd done on a regular pay. And that was quite significant in terms of, well, Rhodesian dollars. I mean, yeah, it was quite a lot of money. And you were put on all sorts of allowances. You got a bush allowance, and you got a special unit allowance, and yeah, you got a parachute allowance, I think. Yeah, so it all added up. Of course, that took a long time for that money to come through, and lots of banging on doors and the blooming Commando clerk. Yeah, but eventually I got it all. Yeah.
So was your 18 months done in RLI, or did you go to another unit first?
No, RLI. Yeah, so all the national service recruits who were told to report to Cranbourne all ended up, or most of them ended up in the RLI. Yeah, yeah.
And that was quite a strenuous course, as we've heard from other interviewees. But what did it speak to you? Did you enjoy that training? Did you say, what the hell, big mistake? Or did you find that comradeship was already forming at that point?
Yeah, definitely was forming then. Yeah, I mean, the first 6 weeks were hell. Yeah, they really were, that basic training where it was just, run till you drop, change parades or things like that. And yeah, but there was a light at the end of the tunnel, after 6 weeks, when they let you go to the canteen, you could have 2 beers. Yeah, you felt you'd kind of arrived almost at that stage. And then the second phase of 6 weeks was the conventional warfare training, and that included, I think, the 120 miler, or was that in the third? Yeah, that was in that phase. Yeah, and I mean, the drill and the bullshit were always there, but they sort of slightly eased up a bit as you became more and more competent. You got fit, you became disciplined, you became well trained. And yeah, and then the third phase, or the last 6 weeks, was the counterinsurgency phase. And by that time, you were starting to feel an element of pride in what you were doing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Can you remember any of your peers from that course, guys that you became very good friends with, who sort of became well known later on in the army, or was it just a bunch of mates that you really enjoyed your time with?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, a few of them went on to become officers. Went on to officers course. Quite a few of them specialized and went on to become medics and signalers and things like that. I'm trying to think. I mean, all the top recruits on our course, they all ended up as instructors, which I thought odd. You surely want your best soldiers, best recruits, to go and become your best soldiers, but that's what happened. Yeah, I can't think offhand anyone who did anything special, but yeah, I mean, we had some really good guys, and yeah, yeah.
I think that's one of the strengths of Willis inherited from the British Army, and the Rhodesian Army followed suit, where the best were sent as trainers and as instructors, particularly in the Air Force. during the Second World War, which enabled that knowledge to go into junior pilots and kept the standards up. Whereas the Germans, for example, the top men, Galland and all that lot, they stayed at the front line till they died. And so the recruits coming through, they had no idea how to attack enemy aircraft, and they were shot down in droves. So
Yeah,
I can see the point of getting the best guys, but maybe they should have had some operational experience before they were turned into instructors.
I would think so. Yeah, I mean, it was only intake 150, which was my intake, where that started happening, as because they were running short of instructors and they didn't want to pull guys from the bush, and there weren't enough guys going through the drill and weapons course and things like that to become instructors. But yeah, so all our instructors on our intake 150 had bush experience, combat experience. And some of them, a few of them, then went back to the bush, and there were more than a few who were killed in action. Yeah, very, very sad. Yeah.
So at that point, were you sent straight to 3 Commando, or was there another unit in between that?
No, we had 4 squads on our course because it was the biggest intake, and I think 150 Llewellyn was probably the biggest intake as well at the time ever. And so the same with Cranbourne. We had probably started off with, I can't remember the numbers, but I mean, lots. There were like 400 perhaps recruits, maybe more, I don't know. And divided into 4 squads, red, blue, green, and yellow, which loosely matched the commando. So red squad, effectively, they would go to 1 commando. Blue squad would go to 2 commando, green squad 3 commando, and yellow squad to support group at the time. It soon became support commando. Yeah, and I just happened to be in green squad, just because where I was in the queue when we were registering, being allocated into our squads. And that was more or less the done thing, that you would then go into the commando of your color. So one, red squad's would go to 1 commando, etc. You didn't have to. You could choose. I mean, we had a few blue squad guys who came to 3 commando and vice versa. So yeah, and also quite a few guys left at that stage to go on to engineers or other units, specialist units, things like that. A few guys went to the SAS, stuff like that. Yeah.
So signing on, did that prompt them to send you on a para course, which they may not have done with the national servicemen? Did you do that then or later?
No, the first para course was in December 76, and that was 1 commando. They did the first para course. They were the first commando to become para trained, and the first commando to go to be used in the fire force role. 3 commando, my commando, we were the second. So straight after the 1 commando course in December, New Serum in December 76, in January 77, 2 of our troops were sent on para course, 11 troop and 14 troop. Yeah, so we were right behind. We were the second para course of the battalion. You had no choice. They didn't send national servicemen who were due to be let go in January 1976. Yeah, there was no point. In retrospect, there would have been a point had they been allowed to come back and do their call-ups with RLI, which happened, but too late. I mean, 78, 79, that started happening. Yeah, so we had no choice. There were a couple of guys who just refused. They said, we're not going to be doing para course, and they got kicked out. The commander sent somewhere else. Yeah, so that was it. Yeah.
I've asked other guys this question because I'm interested in the answer, but the very first time you jumped out the door, what was the feeling? Did you enjoy it? Terrified?
I think the second jump was more scary because you kind of knew what to expect. The first jump, I think there were just 2 of you, a stick of 2, kicked out, and then the next 2 and the next 2. It was quite exciting. Yeah, and exhilarating when you jumped out and you landed and you'd done everything supposedly correctly. And I remember there was a Rhodesia Herald reporter taking photographs, and he was right next to me when I landed. And the next day there was this pic of me on the front page of the Herald. Yeah, looking mean.
Good timing, eh?
Yeah, with our stupid motorbike helmets, because they didn't have any para helmets, so they used motorbike helmets. Yeah,
yeah,
and
very.
you couldn't hear because they came around behind your ears,
Yeah,
like free fall stuff. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Like a Darth Vader type of helmet, but yeah, brilliant, man.
yeah.
So even in your national service, where was your first operational posting? Was it Grand Reef or some other place?
No, Mount Darwin. Yeah, that was where it was all happening. Mount Darwin. So I think we finished our recruits course in May '76. That was 4.5 months or whatever it was. Got a week's R&R, and then boom, we were all sent up to join the Commando. They were on fire force duties at Mount Darwin. Yeah,
Yeah, a very hot place because from sort of what 76 onwards or 77, they were just pouring into the country in the northeast, weren't they?
that's right. I mean, it coincided that massive influx of Zanla into the country in the northeast coincided with the onset of the dry season, the end of the rains, put it that way. Yeah, and that's when they started flooding into the country, and Mount Darwin became particularly hot. And I mean, every other bush trip, because the bush trips then were 6 weeks, so there would be records broken of which commando got the most kills. And I remember in June '76, I think we broke the record. We got, I think, 65 killed in that bush trip or something. I don't know. The Rhodesians are a bit like the Americans in Vietnam. They had some sort of thing about body counts. Yeah. Anyway.
Which at the end of the
Yeah.
day was fairly futile, considering there were millions of them and just a few thousand of us. And it was like trying to empty a bath with a teaspoon, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I could never quite get my head around it. But I think it was the sort of competition with other commandos, and rah, we got the most kills this bush trip, and that was soon eclipsed. Every subsequent bush trip, another commando would come on fire force, and they would beat the record, and it ended up in hundreds, really. Yeah.
Chris, because because it's basically a military channel, although we'd like to interview civilians. Talk us through some of your actual contacts. What was your first experience like? Was it shocking? Were you expecting the enemy to walk past? What happened?
I had absolutely, no expectation whatsoever. We were on fire force, as I mentioned. Well, it was funny in those days. The commando would go on fire force call up, but only half the commando would be doing fire force. The other half of the commando would be bumbling around the bush on patrols or OPs or things like that. So there were only 2 out of the 4 troops or platoons that would be on fire force duties. That soon changed when the need for more troops and airborne facility came into operation. That changed, and they needed more troops. But yeah, the first call up I'd been, it was 11 and 14 troop were on fire force operations. I was, they put up a board every evening with who was in what stick and what stop they would be. So you had stops 1, 2, 3, and then you had, which was 3 alouettes, and then they had stops 4, 5, 6 for the second wave. If the helicopters would come back, or the second wave would jump onto lorries and head off to nearer the contact and be picked up there. And I remember being put into stock 2, I think, with Corporal Seward. He was an Aussie veteran. He'd been in the Commando for quite a while. And I remember The machine gunner was an old soldier, old, i.e., been in the Commando for forever, but it turned out his name was Van Biljon. He was an MAG gunner, and he'd only been there like 6-10 weeks longer than us, but we regarded him as an old soldier. And then there was another guy, a Rhodesian guy, who was our rifleman. The fire force was still evolving then, the whole modus operandi, and we had this very convoluted process with fire force. That fire force was actually based at Mount Darwin airfield. Well, the Air Force, the helicopters were based there. We were at the police camp in Mount Darwin, or next to the police camp. So either we had to jump on 4.5s trucks and head off down the road to the fire force, or they would come and land on the helicopters, come to us and land on the volleyball court or whatever, which is what happened actually. And I remember what I particularly remember was the siren went, and everybody was Sergeant Major Derek Fraser shouting and screaming everybody to get their asses in gear and get to the LZ as quickly as possible, and basically double checking that everyone had all their gear and all that kind of stuff. And then we jumped on the helicopter. All the pilots were basically our age. They were young guys as well, who hadn't been involved in flying for too long. Obviously, the K car commander, and the RLI, our OC, who was a guy called Captain Donald. We didn't have a major at the time. He was our K car commander. He was the ground troops commander. So they led the way off on the helicopter, and we 3 G cars, we followed. And it was I remember being seriously exhilarating on that flying on those helicopters at low altitude, very low altitude, just above treetops towards the contact zone. And I remember the rifleman next to me. He was a big guy, nice guy, and he turned to me. He was intake 149, so essentially he was only 6 weeks. Had been in the army 6 weeks longer than us. And he turned to me in the helicopter and shouted in my ear, "Aren't you scared?" And I thought, "What?" And I wasn't scared because I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen. Absolutely none. Anyway, we eventually get to where the contact areas, the call-out area is. So we get dropped. The 3 sticks get dropped around the contact area, and there we are on the ground. We sort of spread out into extended line. I knew that much how to do, and Corporal Seward didn't pay any attention whatsoever to his men. He had Van Biljon on his right, I was on the far right, and then the other rifleman was on his left. He just expected us to know what to do, which was spread out, don't bunch up, in extended line, and start sweeping forward through the bush. I had no idea what we were sweeping forward to do, and all I was concerned was maintaining my dressing, that I wasn't going to get out of line and do something wrong. And then stop, and we went to cover, and a Lynx airstrike came in. That's what we were waiting for. And that was that was an eye-opener, because it came in low to our front, across our front, and then it dropped these Frantan or napalm bombs that went tumbling, and there's this black smoke where the airstrike had struck, and I remember that smell to this day. And then we went forward again to sweep forward to the area, and then bang, bang, bang. Corporal Seward contacted a guerrilla who had survived the airstrike. I saw nothing. I just saw basically Corporal Seward sort of shooting. I didn't see a guerrilla or anything. I didn't know what's going on. And he killed him. And we then swept forward again into the contact area where there were several bodies from the airstrike. some wounded, most dead, and they'd been taken out by the napalm. Yeah, pretty horrendous. I just looked at this lot and I thought, my word, what is going on here? And that was effectively the end of the contact. We would then had to recover all the enemy bodies. That was done back then. So we then had to drag all the corpses to LZ, central LZ, where they could be uplifted in those big nets underneath the helicopter and taken off to Mount Darwin special branch, I think, for identification. Or they still did those sort of things back then. Yeah, yeah. So that was my first contact. Really, it was just I didn't know what was going on. I soon learned, it soon started working for me that I started to understand how it all worked. But yeah, and that was the first time I'd seen dead bodies. I mean, I remember having to drag the one that Corporal Stewart had killed, and his limbs kept getting hooked up around rocks, and Van Billion was cussing because he's carrying his gun as well, and he's cussing while he and I had to pull this body and kept kicking it. And yeah, it was. I thought, is this how we treat the dead? And yeah, it was. So yeah, pulled them all to a central. Yeah,
and there's
LZ.
massive broken bones. When an FN bullet hits the enemy, and huge wounds, and really, it's just it's a caricature of a human being that you're carrying because they're so smashed up.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's almost like a bag of meat with a few bones in it.
Yeah, and yeah, I remember how grotesque is the word. Some of the damage that was done to these bodies, and I mean, it looked like some of them looked like a massive boulder had been dropped on the guy's head, but it was just an FN round, or maybe it'd been the 20 mil round from the K car. I don't know, but yeah, absolutely grotesque, yeah, yeah.
Obviously, as the repetition of that Fire Force experience happened again and again and again, did it start to affect you psychologically? I know you mentioned in your book Fire Force that obviously in all armies there's a bit of smoking the old weed and all that sort of stuff. Did you find that you needed sort of some type of refuge to withdraw into? I don't want to get too American in this interview, with all due respect to them, but did you find you needed to take the edge off after a while? How did you deal with that?
Yeah, I don't think we realized we needed to take the edge off. We just did. I mean, it was always the big thing was getting back to base, to the Fire Force base, and then having a couple of beers that night. And yeah, a lot of the guys smoked weed, as you say. A lot of South Africans in our commando, and the RLI in general, up until the sort of mid-70s. Yeah, and they all smoked weed. And of course, all the guerrillas smoked weed as well. So it was always a big thing to hit a cache with guerrillas, with a cache of weed and money.
Yeah,
you want to hit
the paymaster.
Paymaster, yeah. You heard all those stories there of
yeah,
hitting a paymaster, yeah. But I don't think it was. Well, certainly in my case, it only started affecting me mentally. I think after a couple of years, it took quite a while. For the actual reality, really, I think, and what we were doing to actually sink in. And yeah, it took a while. Yeah.
The impression I got, maybe I'm wrong, but I read your book so long ago but only little bits are stuck in my mind. But I think you were fairly adverse to guys with rank, were you? Did you have any officers that you enjoyed? And, the K car commanders, are there any of them that you thought were really good?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I don't want to disparage anyone, but a regular officer did a 12-month training, whereas a national service officer did 4.5 months.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we had again, because of a shortage of manpower, we were getting some national service officers into the RLI, and they were treated exactly the same as the regular officers. Um, there were some who were standing, there were some who were not. And even the regular officers, there were some superb officers and many who were not. But yeah, I mean, my first troop officer was a guy called Roddy Smith, from Durban. What a nice guy. I think he got a bronze. He got wounded on my first bush trip. And I thought, come on, man. I mean, just got to like this guy. And yeah, he got wounded. Um, he never came back to the commando. He went off to Salute Scouts. The 12th troop officer was a guy called Mark Adams. He died recently, and I mean, after the war, we became good mates. We really did. But he was an absolute bastard. He really was, and I felt so sorry for all those guys in 12th troop who ended up in Mark Adams' stick. But an absolute professional, ultimate soldier. And then, yeah, I can't remember the 13 and 14 troop was a guy called Gordon Jug Thornton, who'd been at school with me. I think he ended up as the battalion adjutant. He also became a KCAR commander. There were a lot of good KCAR commanders in the RLI. I mean, our first one was our OC, Captain Donald, Kipper Donald. He was a superb KCAR commander. He really was. But again, he didn't last long, and he also went off to Salute Scouts. You know, a lot of our guys went to the Salute Scouts. He lost a lot of people to the Scouts. And after him came Jerry Strong. He'd been sort of honor at Sandhurst, you know, that old school roadie type officer. Yeah, and then after him came Ian Buttonshaw, and then came Bruce Snellgar, who was perhaps one of our legends in terms of KCAR commanders. I think he got a Silver Cross posthumously. Yeah.
The interesting thing about Snellgar is that he was our head boy at Churchill School, and we always had to read from the Bible at opening of when you first arrived at school. You will go into the hall assembly, and Bruce, you know, the transformation in people is amazing, because he used to shake like this. He got so nervous reading from the Bible, and you know, as the head boy, and yet he transformed into this magnificent warrior. Another one was a hunter pilot. I won't mention his name, but if you said boo to him at school, he would withdraw into the classroom somewhere to be near a teacher. And yet he turned out to be a superb hunter pilot. So you can't put this.
Yeah.
It's just the way things are.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, probably an unfair comment, but I did find the guys who'd been the jocks at school, you know, the big guys and the water polo players and the big rugby players and that, they often were disappointing in terms of, yeah, and it would sometimes almost like the nerds and the geeks who became superb, you know. Yeah.
Would you
Generalization.
Would you agree that our war, as most wars were, was basically fought by and won by the corporals and the sergeants? Would you support that?
Yeah, it's often been called a corporal's war, hasn't it? And I think that's simply because of the nature of the warfare, in that we were broken down, as you would know, into small sticks of 5 force for 4 men, with a troopie or an NCO in charge. So, and I mean, a troopie could call in an airstrike. So, yeah, and did very often, for example. Yeah, down to you know, sticks of like 8, sort of when on patrol in the bush and things like that. I think a lot of the territorial companies had those sort of size sticks. Yeah, so it was very much, yeah, the junior NCOs, the troopies, the senior troopies. Yeah, they were the leaders of the fire force operations, particularly. Obviously the officers were involved. Each troop had his officer involved. Obviously, he would be leading a stick. And then the K car commander was generally captain or a major, but often a lieutenant. So even up to that level, there was the officers were sometimes quite junior in terms of leadership. But yeah, I think because of the nature of the warfare, and there were a lot of junior soldiers who were involved in the leadership aspect. So yeah, very much so a corporal's war, as they called it.
What would your definition be of a good leader, whether he be a corporal or a lieutenant or a sergeant? What's your what would you look for in a leader?
That's a very good question. I would look for someone who respected his troops.
Yeah.
He didn't rely on iron discipline. He led by example. He was not afraid to ask advice of his troops, and often, not always, but often would make decisions based on the team. Yeah, so everyone got an input into to what they were going to do and how they were going to carry out a particular task. Not always, and it wasn't always necessary. Not a strict disciplinarian. I mean, those days were gone, of having strict disciplinarians. Everyone knew their job. The new guys, they would be led by the older troopies. When you selected your sticks, as I ended up as a lance corporal. Actually, I ended up as a commander of 11 troop one stage, simply because there were no senior NCOs and officers around. They either dead, wounded, or were away on forces. So I was the senior troopie at the time, so I got to lead 11 troop for a couple of months, and I would always select my sticks, allocate my sticks based on a mixture of youth and experience. You don't put all the new guys into one stick and expect them to perform. So you'd have to have at least one new guy per stick or more, depending. But yeah, and you always match, and it was mixing and matching, sort of making that troopie would work well in that particular stick, because that machine gunner knew his stuff. And very much that sort of situation. Yeah.
Could you talk us through maybe 2, possibly 3 fire force operations that were really successful? If you could describe what happened, where it happened, and maybe even ones that you observed from a higher position. If you could just enlighten us in that regard, Chris.
I think the first, excuse me, the first major fire force operation I was involved in, and in fact it turned out to be the first major fire force operation of the war, and it became sort of colloquial known as Hill 31, only because we accounted for 31 guerrillas on a hill. It became, the Americanism, Hill 31, Battle of. And that was in November 1976. And I was in Stop 1. We were based up on the Hondi Valley Escarpment, I think up near Mtarazi Falls, somewhere around there. And God, it was cold. Anyway, my stop leader, I was in Stop 1. I was a rifleman in Stop 1. And we had, again, a mixture of youth and experience. Roddy Smith had come back. He came back for a little bit, I beg your pardon. And he was the stick leader. He'd recovered from his wound. Had an experienced MAG gunner, a guy called Humphrey van der Merwe, who was a national serviceman, finishing his, I think he was finishing his year. And then we had a brand new Canadian, a guy called MacDonald, who had no military experience at all. And he was kind of rotund, and he was the inexperience. And off we went. There'd been a call out, and I remember Nick Meikle was our proper pilot, was on the back of his helmet. It said Meikle, which I spotted. And Nick and I talk about this to this day. And I remember we went, we lifted off from the escarpment, the 3G cars and the K car, again, Kipper Donald in the K car. And we flew over the escarpment and into the Hondi Valley, and there was this drop. And I thought my guts were going to come out. Yeah. And we just dropped. Yeah. Whoa. But what a thrill, what a buzz, as it turned out. And I was starting to understand now how call-outs worked, and I could understand that what had happened, a lot of it came afterwards, but what had happened was this big sort of this massive mountain, pretty well on the border with Mozambique, and a group of apparently 50, 60 Zana guys had infiltrated a couple of nights before and were based up on the mountain with a view to then splitting up into groups to infiltrate the country. And they had been picked up by a guy called Laurie Ryan. He was with 4th Battalion Trackers. And the 4th Bat Trackers were kind of legendary in terms of their skills and fighting ability. So these guys had picked up their tracks, and that morning of the call out, they had a contact at the base of the mountain with a couple of guerrillas who were obviously trying to exfiltrate, or I don't know what they were doing, and they killed a couple. And that's when they called in fire force, because they suddenly realized the enormity of this. They knew they couldn't handle a mountain and 50 odd guerrillas on their own. So they called fire force, which happened to be us, 3 Commando. And at the same time, there were a few RAR sticks who'd been based in the Hondi Valley, and they were deployed to the other side to the eastern side of the mountain, on the border side of the mountain, I think by truck. And they sort of covered that aspect. They formed like a stop line on the eastern side of the mountain. And the plan was that the fire force would come in, hook up with the 4th Bat Trackers at the base of the mountain, and then Kipper Donald would, as the fire force commander, would then deploy us from there, all the sticks, and then the choppers would go back and collect the second wave, who were actually based at Ruda, not where we were. And they came quite promptly, because it's not far, so within a fairly short space of time, we had good 2 waves, so that's 6 sticks, 6 RLI sticks, again 11 troop and 14 troop mainly, and then the RAR troops on the eastern side. I'm not sure how many there were. And then there were even a couple of, I don't know if they were police reserve or territorial sticks as well involved. I don't know how they fitted in. Old guys, we thought. And yeah, so Roddy Smith, we were then instructed to move up the western side of the mountain, up one particular re-entrant, and the other sticks were deployed up other re-entrants, and basically to advance the mountain. And it was fairly heavy going in terms of foliage and ravines, and yeah, it was heavy going. We'd got to, after about an hour, we'd arrived at this one gully, ravine, basically. Rhodesians called them re-entrants for some reason. I call them ravines, gullies. And we'd stopped for a smoke break, or we'd been told to stop there by the K car, and then we heard noise, clink, clink, clink. And there were a couple of guerrillas. We could hear them clattering down the mountain, because meanwhile, while this had been happening, the K car and the Lynx had been putting airstrikes up on top of the mountain, where the guerrillas were all holed up, but all over, not just in one group. They were sort of scattered all over the summit and around the summit. So there was continual K car activity, 20 mil firing away, and then the Lynx would come in. I don't think we had any jets at that stage involved. No, it was just the Lynx, I think. And of course, the G cars were sort of buzzing around the mountain with their side gunners having a go. And we got to this re-entry, and we could hear this noise, and we knew it was guerrillas. Absolutely knew. I mean, there were no, what's a civvy doing up on top of a mountain? And clatter, clatter, bang, bang, and Roddy Smith immediately starts getting excited. I mean, he's like a Jack Russell. You can see his tail, kind of like, yeah, action. And he he then took him and Humphrey, the machine gunner, crawled up to the edge of the ravine, waited till the guerrillas came in sight and opened fire. Um, Killed one immediately, wounded another, and I don't know what happened. Then there was another, excuse me, and who managed to escape the initial barrage. So we were throwing grenades in, and eventually, I think we accounted for two in that initial contact we had. And I remember MacDonald, the Canadian guy, his eyes were like saucers. He must have been like I was during my first contact. He had absolutely no idea what was going on. And then one thing I remember is that Humphrey managed to grab a hat from one of the guerrillas, and it was like that Snoopy Dog hat that had ears, flaps for ears. And Humphrey thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread, so he wore that for the rest of the contact. So we had two Zanla bodies. Obviously, we've got to go and search them. We take all their weaponry. We can't leave it there. So we end up carrying, crikey, all the sort of guerrilla weaponry, grenades, magazines. You know, we're heavily laden enough with our own stuff as it is. And now you've got to carry an extra weapon, a rifle, SKS or AK-47, which we gave most of it to MacDonald, the new guy. You know, he must carry it, do something useful. And then we're told, no, we were halfway up the mountain by now. And we were told, no, we got to sort of slowly make our way up to the top. And by now, Rod Smith's blood was up. He could smell blood. He wanted more. And yeah, so we advanced up the mountain. And suddenly, I mean, this is like, it took us about 2 hours then from between that stage and getting to near the summit of the mountain. But we could hear contacts going on non-stop. All around the mountain, there were contacts taking place. The airstrikes, the 20 mil was still going in on top of the mountain. And we then got to near the summit, probably about 50 feet from the summit. And we came across, I think we'd been told to hook up with them, a territorial stick. I don't know whether, I don't think they were in-depth company. I think they were possibly fourth bat territorials on call-up. And I mean, we thought they were really old. They're probably kind of like in their 30s, you know? And they're these guys, and they were not happy. They didn't want to be there. So they were told they could head on back down, and we would take over their position near the summit. And we then went, sort of sat down and went into cover, an extended line. And I could see from there the summit, and it was like a bald granite summit, probably about 100 meters in circumference. No, radius 100 meters across. This area of, and then surrounded by bush, quite thick bush. And looking in the there were bodies. They're just all over. I remember looking at it, there's a body, gorilla being killed, obviously taken out by a K-car or airstrikes. And there must have been 8 or 9 bodies scattered around. And we'd arrived quite soon after, I think. There'd been this sort of battle on top of the mountain. And we were sitting there waiting for instructions. And then, lo and behold, I see this gorilla walking into the clearing on top of the mountain there. I really remember, tall guy. He was probably about 50, 75 meters from where we were. He had no idea we were there. And he was carrying 2 weapons at the trail, one in each hand. But he was walking like he was like a zombie. I think he was just absolutely in shell shock. I mean, he obviously didn't know what had happened, and he was just walking. Didn't know where he was going into this clearing. And I nudged Humphrey, and who was next to me with a machine gun, and I said, Humphrey, there's a guerrilla, there's a Zanla guy. And Humphrey looked and he looked. He said, no, he's not. He's RAR. Because they were not far the other side, down the other side of the escarpment. I said, what's RAR doing with AKs? That's not a Rhodesian army kit. That's a guerrilla. I'm telling you. And Humphrey said, no. So I'm going to shoot. I'm going to shoot him. So, and Humphrey was having absolute kittens about it. He said, no, don't. He's a RAR guy. So I lifted my rifle and took aim at the chest, which is, you're always told to aim at the chest, which is the largest target area, and fired one shot, and it hit the guy straight between the eyes, and he just dropped. Humphrey went absolutely ballistic. You've just killed an RAR soldier. You've killed a Rhodesian. Blah 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 blah. And now Rod Smith's up there. What's going on? What's going on? He comes around, and so we advance into the clearing, and sure enough, he was a guerrilla. I mean, we could have captured him if we'd been so inclined. And that was, I mean, I'm not proud of it. Basically a defenseless guy, but who was absolutely just out of it. He really was. And that was my first confirmed kill. I'd been involved in others, but this one I knew for sure. It was my bullet. I only fired one shot, and my chest shot had, I mean, I was not a good shot. That hit him in the head. Fortunately for him, that was a quick end. So we then go on the top of the mountain, and we just survey this carnage, absolute carnage of all these guerrillas. And we were, excuse me, and we were the first stick up onto the top of the mountain. The fourth back trackers were still down at the bottom of the hill. They were having a wonderful time catching all the guerrillas who were trying to escape at the bottom. I mean, they killed lots. They really did. And then the second wave, RLI, they were also around the base of the mountain in stop groups, catching all the enemy trying to flee down there. And we were then sort of clearing the top of the mountain there, and we came across, I suddenly saw one of the bodies move. I thought, hello. He was lying face down under a bush, and he looked up like this, and he said, don't shoot. And I got such a fright that I got my rifle into my shoulder and shot at a go at him and missed. I mean, kind of like point blank. I sort of winged him on the ear. And of course, Roddy Smith, smelling blood again, comes scuttling up and said, what's going on here? And I said, I'll just try to shoot him, but I missed. I remember he said, what a shit shot. I said, well, do you want me to try again? Awful what I did. And he said, no, we could, we need a capture. So let's capture him. So this guy's now, he's managed to, he's been shot, obviously, in the lower part of his body. It was in his legs. He'd been shot. I think 20 mil shrapnel or something had probably been taken him out. He sort of was lifting his torso and head off, and you could see his absolute terror in his eyes. And he said, please, don't shoot, please, in English, good English, don't shoot. And so we thought, yeah, okay. Well, we managed to pull him out from under the bushes, and you could see he'd been fairly grievously shot all around his legs. And now what to do with him? Because now Kipper Donald knows you've got to capture, and they want him alive. I found out his name is Cuthbert. We got chatting to him. Nice guy, actually. Our age, 18, if that. And Roddy Smith says, we've got to get this guy down to the bottom of the mountain. But there was still contacts going on all over the place. And I thought, you're crazy. How are we going to get this guy down this serious incline with contacts going on left, right, and center? So I said, can't we just get a helicopter to land on top of the clearing and then put him on the helicopter? Or if that doesn't work, put him on a stretcher and hoik him up to a helicopter on a stretcher. And Rod Smith said, yeah, that's quite a good idea. put it to Kipper Donald, who said, no, we can't do that. We can't have a helicopter coming in and the risk of being shot out the sky. You got to take him down. And yeah, I mean, and took him down. We did. It took like 2 hours or more to get to the bottom of the mountain. And in between that time, we had several contacts on the way. And by which stage it was me and MacDonald, Van Humphrey couldn't carry the guy because he was an MAG gunner. We needed him for protection. And he and Roddy Smith had like 2 or 3 contacts on the way down and killed more guerrillas. While MacDonald and I just sort of collapsed onto the path or whatever it was. And poor old Cuthbert just got dropped with us while we waited for Rod Smith to finish his contact. And we eventually got him down to the bottom of the hill, and he was then uplifted by a helicopter. And that was the end of the day. It was starting to get, I mean, we'd been there since dawn, 6 a.m. in the morning, and it was now becoming dusk and time for uplift. Yeah, and that was that. Quite a few sticks had to stay out overnight on top of the mountain, on the mountain, and continue clearing up the following day. There were a couple more very minor contacts the following day, and at the end of the day, the body count was 31 plus Cuthbert. So it was 31 plus 1. And I remember we then went back, all the sticks went back to, there was a school at the bottom of at the bottom of the mountain, and all the bodies, all 31 bodies were laid out on one of the playing fields at the school. Yeah, fairly gruesome sight. And all the school kids were there looking at this. Fairly hectic. And and as you say, the bodies were in various stages of decomposition, grotesque, brains all over, guts hanging out. And I mean, of course, the whole place was just riddled with flies. And like a lot of them, I mean, were naked or had lost their trousers. And this is, I don't know if that's a thing with death, but they had these massive erections. I just remember that thing. It was absolutely grotesque. Yeah, so I don't know why they were put there. I think possibly as a lesson to the locals. This is what happens to guerrillas. Yeah. So that was the end of that. And it was a big thing. The biggest single contact, fire force contact, but it was not just fire force. There were, other units involved. RLI, 4th Bat, quite a lot of other units involved. So yeah, it was the biggest fire force contact of the war to date, and it was also the biggest internal contact of the war to date. I mean, I think there had been externally there had been the Salisbury Nyazonia raid across the border in Nyazonia, where they killed thousands. But the biggest contact internally in the country. Yeah, so that was the one particular, and it was on the front page of the Rhodesia Herald, and there all the second wave guys managed to get their photos at what did I say where they were based at Ruda. Yeah, they were there at the Intaf Keep, and they had all the guerrilla weaponry laid out. I mean, geez, you name it, everything was there. RPDs, RPGs, hundreds of SKSs, AK-47s. Yeah, even a couple of those trailed Soviet heavy machine guns. So yeah, it was a big thing. And there was a picture of Laurie Rowan, who started it all. He was unfortunately killed. Friendly fire later in the war. Yeah, legend, Laurie Rowan, and all his 4th Bat trackers. Yeah,
he was the guy with the beard, hey, a dark head.
Yeah.
They
all had beards actually.
He was very well known actually. A little point you may not know is in Peter Bauer's book, Winds of Destruction. He also called in a hunter strike on a large group of tourists sitting under a tree, and the hunter dropped bombs made up of flechettes you know, the nails with the fins,
Yeah.
6 inches long,
Yeah.
and it killed 54 of them.
Sure.
The tree
Yeah.
just peppered with these flechettes and that type of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I don't know if they were legal. There was, you know, always some controversy over these things, but
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think Ryan also initiated that one. Quite an amazing character.
Yeah. He was.
Mm.
Yeah. 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 So that was that. That was the one particularly memorable contact, just for the sheer size of it. In terms, I mean, and from then on, it just became a regular thing with Fire Force. During '77, we were effectively pulled out from doing these futile patrols and OPs during Fire Force operations. So the whole commando would become Fire Force uh, role. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that became increasingly the case as '77 wore on and into '78. And then I think in '79, I'd left by early '79, February '79. The RLI became purely allocated to external operations, and local fire forces were taken over by RAR and the RR companies.